Brexit bounce continues is not the headline many predicted when we finally left the European Union years after we voted to do so.
Predictions that the sky would fall in, everything would run short, we wouldn't even get our medicine, have tumbled one after the other.
The fate of the car industry after Brexit was one of the most commonly deployed tropes. And so when Nissan made their announcement last week that they were investing £1 billion in Sunderland in a new electric car development, there was much rejoicing, except amongst the most embittered Remainers.
Joining us to discuss how Brexit is going is esteemed economist and former banking guru, Dr. Gerard Lyons.
Dr. Gerard is a leading UK economist with over 30 years' experience. He currently has a number of different roles in the financial centre and across the field of economics. He speaks to us today in a personal capacity. Dr. Gerard, always a pleasure to see you. Let's begin with Nissan. They said that if we Brexited, car making in the northeast of England would be no more. Now we know it's about to boom. How do you account for that?
Well, hello, it's great to be on the show again. Yes, this is a very good news story from Nissan. Good for the UK car industry, good for the UK economy. Good in a number of respects, partly because of the company itself, because Nissan had threatened to leave the UK, indeed, if the UK did not join the euro, and then it threatened to leave the UK again if we left the EU. But as we're now seeing, it's investing more. I'm not surprised by this because Sunderland is Nissan's most productive plant across Western Europe. So I think we should see this as a positive in its own right, but also I think it's a constructive feature in two other respects. One, because as a consequence of this, and also as a consequence of the UK now being outside the EU, the UK now needs to build bigger supply chains within the motor industry within the UK, and Nissan will be doing that in the northeast. And the other aspect is because this is linked to the green agenda as well, it goes hand in hand in showing that green can go alongside positive economic growth. So overall, I do think this was a very constructive and positive story for the car industry and for the economy as well.
Now, this investment goes in pair with a subsidy from the government, which has been used as an argument by the Remainers that it's not really much of an improvement. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I was quite surprised by the reaction people showed last week, because in some respects it was disconnected from the reality of what's happening in this gigabattery industry. China, South Korea and Japan lead in this technology. And in the last couple of years, European governments have been bending over backwards to attract gigafactories into their own country. Take earlier this year, in the first quarter, Tesla, which is worth more than all the rest of the motor industry globally combined, and as we know, its owner is one of the richest men in the world, they were actually given a subsidy of around £880 million, according to the press, to build such a gigafactory near Berlin. Poland's led the way in terms of Western Europe in terms of attracting these gigafactories. And last week, before Nissan's announcement, I think I could tot up about 38 such factories across Western Europe. And as far as I can make out, all, if not the most of them, have all received some sort of government subsidy. So the government subsidy, you might not like it, but I think it's part of the overall equation in terms of attracting this industry. We're now likely, I think, to see Vauxhall receive a subsidy as well to set up such a factory in Ellesmere Port. So that will be positive for the Northwest. Look, government subsidies are not the way to always do business, but sometimes they're a necessary feature, as we've seen historically in the UK and as we're seeing currently across Western Europe.
Isn't it true, though, that some people will never take yes for an answer? They will never accept that anything in post-Brexit Britain is a positive development. They pine to rejoin the European Union, even though, as you say, the very criticism they're making in this case would apply equally to Angela Merkel inside the EU on the Tesla investment.
Yeah. To be truthful, George, I try and not use the word Brexit at all now because I think we need to have moved on. But I think part of the problem for Britain was that in the immediate aftermath of the referendum in 2016, we then had 3 years of a political crisis. And that did not help things domestically and didn't help the image of the UK globally. Then, of course, after the December 2019 election, while that started to move us onto a more positive footing, we then had the whole issue about the withdrawal agreement being negotiated, and on top of that, COVID. So it's a very complex and it's been a very embittered environment. But I certainly think now, with the economy recovering from COVID, although one or two sectors still being hit very hard, as we emerge from the pandemic, I'd like to think that now we can start to think very constructively. It's very important for the UK to have a sensible future relationship with the EU, but at the same time, the important thing is that that does not tie our hands on our domestic agenda or in terms of our global ambitions. And so I do think we need to move on. One or two areas there are still difficulties, such as the financial sector. But overall, coming back to your question, yes, I do think we need to step back, look at this in a more constructive and I think a positive light. And indeed, I think that's the way things will move in the future.
Well said. But the criticism, for example, of labour shortage in certain sectors always comes back to the end of so-called freedom of movement, meaning the movement of cheap labour from East and Central Europe. Why isn't the emphasis on let's raise wages? If we pay more wages, we'll attract workers to the sector.
Well, I think that's the direction we will have to go. It's not just EU, actually. One could step back and view this more widely as a consequence of globalization. In the last couple of decades, China in particular became the manufacturing center of the world, and Consumer Price Index, the CPI, was once renamed the China Price Index by some people because China was exporting disinflation pressures, very competitive pressures. Now, China is paying higher wages, but we're still seeing that competition from Vietnam, Bangladesh, and from other countries. And quite rightly, too, from their own perspective, they want to export and do well. But you're right, in Western economies, the shock absorber, the people who felt the hit the hardest have been in the low-skilled, low-wage sectors where wages have been suppressed. Now, what we now need to see is a reassessment of this whole outlook, particularly with the UK outside the EU. And I do think there needs to be a focus on raising wages. Indeed, if one looks at the States, President Biden, he gave a keynote speech at the end of May where he was saying that he wanted higher wages not to be an afterthought, but he saw it as a central feature of his policy agenda. Now, there's pluses and minuses about his policy agenda, but I do think higher wages will be a natural consequence.
How would we drive those wages higher? Raising the national minimum wage, more power for trade unions to collectively bargain, some kind of more central role for government? What would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, a whole combination of factors. At the end of the day, it's what the consumer wants that often drives how companies behave. I worked at City Hall in London from 2012 to 2016. The reason for mentioning it is one of the things I did then, I was at the forefront of pushing the London living wage. And the Living Wage Foundation, I thought, did a fantastic job. But the challenge was that whilst some companies engaged, they didn't necessarily see the positive reaction in terms of people coming to spend more with them. So there is often a disconnect between what people say and what they do. People often say they want to see more companies engaging in a whole host of things, but they don't unfortunately reward them by spending more money with those companies. So I think corporate behavior will be part of this. Certainly there is already naturally a national minimum living wage. The living wage itself often needs to be higher in some parts of the country. So I think it's a combination of factors, and also it's linked into the need to have more investment so that we can then start to see higher productive output, and that in turn allows companies to pay more money. So the state intervention is necessary, but if we step back over the last 30 years, George, what's interesting is that one of the contributing factors to low inflation has been the declining share of wages in Western economies. and that's often squeezed wages at the bottom, as I said earlier. So I would like to expect, or indeed I do expect, to see higher wages creeping in the future, which will be a positive. Then that creates an additional economic challenge about what happens to the overall inflation outlook. But I think that will be kept in check through technology and other aspects. But I think you need to see higher wages, but higher wages going hand in hand with improved output or improved productivity.
Are we in a V-shaped recovery now, Doctor?
I don't think it's right to sort of always use those sort of letter-type analogies, partly because it's so much more nuanced. But the economy is undoubtedly recovering. It's recovering pretty solidly. It's basically the economy fell off the edge of a cliff in spring of last year, then had a mini peak last October. Then we had the second and third lockdown. And as the health issue has improved, as vaccination rollout has taken place, and as unlocking has occurred, we've started to see the economy recover. It is, however, 3.7% below its pre-recession or pre-COVID hit. So 3.7% below where we were last spring. Now, if we hadn't had a pandemic, we would be worried completely about that scale of setback. But because the economy is now recovering, I think we will be back in August, September time to where we were last spring. We then have to realize we have effectively 2 years lost output, 2 years lost growth still to make up. So it's good news, and hence you can use that V-shape analogy, but there are some sectors, particularly in the creative cultural sector, the tourism industry, who are still suffering very badly. So even though the overall economy is recovering, help will still be needed. Unemployment, while not as bad as some people feared, will still be higher, 2.5 to 2.7 million people as we emerge from this pandemic, and still many small firms will be nursing high levels of debt. So overall, the picture is a positive one. We're going in the right direction, but we still need a helping hand in terms of the policy side, and there will still be some legacy impacts, not just on the health front, but on the economic front as we recover towards the end of this year.
I told them you were a guru. Dr. Gerard Lyons, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.